We named our chateau Queen's Escape, and this name is loosely based on the story of the Belgian royal family escaping from Belgium during World War II and coming down to the free part of southern France to escape occupation. The Queen and the children are the ones who actually stayed here at Château de La Tuilerie. Eleanor of Aquitaine was possibly the most powerful woman in all of 12th century Europe. She's one of the few French queens that was actually born in France, and that's why we chose to name one of our queen rooms after her. Also, she was both the Queen of France and of England. Eleanor was born in 1122, historians think. There's no official record of her birth, so we can't be entirely sure. But she was born to William X, and he was the Duke of Aquitaine and the Count of Poitiers. And his land holdings, which was Aquitaine, comprised about a third of all of France. So he was a very, very wealthy man and gave her the absolute best upbringing. The land of Aquitaine at that time also included Bordeaux, well known for its wine region. Eleanor learned to read, write, and converse in Latin. She also studied math, astronomy, history, music, literature, and she learned to hunt and hawk and ride, as well as the more feminine skills of embroidery, spinning, and needlepoint. She was particularly socially gifted. She loved games and dancing, and she was flirty, intelligent, and very strong-willed. She's remembered as someone that had an incredibly fiery and independent spirit, which is another reason that we just loved her as a queen to honor with one of our rooms. As a young girl, Eleanor was raised in Poitiers, and then at some point in her teenage years, her mother and her brother died. And then this changed everything for Eleanor, because all of a sudden her brother was not set to inherit her father's wealth, but Eleanor became the heir. In 1137, Eleanor's father, William X, moved himself and his children to Bordeaux, and he left his children in the care of the archbishop and created a will to ensure that all of his lands would go to Eleanor. Eleanor's father, William X, named Louis VI, the King of France, as Eleanor's official guardian. Eleanor's father left the children in Bordeaux and then went away. And while he was away, he got very sick and he realized that he would die. And he asked his messengers to please keep his death a secret until Louis VI, the king, who was Eleanor's guardian, as well as the archbishop, could be informed and carry out his wishes. After Eleanor's father, William X's death in 1137, all of the lands of Aquitaine passed to Eleanor. And word went out to Louis VI, the King of France, that he had died. Now, Louis was actually at the time fighting a deadly case of dysentery, but he was still thrilled to hear the news because he had an unmarried son, Louis, to be the seventh. And so he quickly betrothed Eleanor to his son, Louis, so that he could then take control of the lands of Aquitaine. So in a big show, Louis VII, the son of the king, he traveled to Bordeaux where Eleanor was, and he took 500 knights with him and just paraded into the town to make a big show and impress her right before they were to be married. So on July 25th of 1137, Eleanor and Louis VII were married, and they became the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine and the Count and Countess of Poitiers. The Archbishop of Bordeaux presided over the ceremony, and then he made very sure that all of the lands of Aquitaine would not automatically pass to Louis VII, but instead they would remain in Eleanor's possession until she and Louis produced an heir. And then only at that time, when he came of age, would that heir, would the lands of Aquitaine then be merged with France. For their wedding, Eleanor gave Louis VII a rock crystal vase with gold details. And this vase is still in existence. It's in the Louvre, and it is the only item left that we know Eleanor to have been in possession of. So while Louis VII and Eleanor were celebrating their wedding, just days later, Louis's father, Louis VI, he died from that bout of dysentery. And so on Christmas of that year, Eleanor and Louis VII became king and queen of the Franks. Eleanor and Louis VII moved to Paris after their marriage, and Eleanor did not find too many friends there. She was not well liked in Paris. She was too loud and outspoken and high-spirited for the demure and rigidly modest society that she came into. She was opinionated, she was outspoken, and the women of that day were more meek and humble. So she liked to wear really colorful clothes and stand out, and it just scandalized the courts in Paris. The church elders did not approve of her, but Louis absolutely adored her. So anything Eleanor would ask for, he would give her. And she started to realize, he does anything I want him to do. So she would really push to see how much she could get him to give her. And it seemed like there were no limits. Eleanor's mother-in-law thought she was an awful influence. So Eleanor's uncle was the ruler of the Crusader kingdoms. And in 1145, Louis pledged himself to lead the Second Crusade to go and protect the kingdom of Jerusalem from Turkish invaders. Eleanor took up the cross herself. She wanted to go with Louis on the crusade, and she recruited many of her ladies in waiting, plus 300 vassals and knights from her home region of Aquitaine to accompany her. She insisted on leading her group of warriors because she was the leader of Aquitaine. And Louis, like always, yes dear, just did whatever she wanted. So the Emperor of Byzantine didn't really want Louis to be successful on the Second Crusade. So what he did was he tried to delay them. So he invited them into his lands and asked his people to celebrate them with lots of banquets and dinners and parties, just to delay them going over to Jerusalem and fighting the Turks. During their time being celebrated in Byzantine, Eleanor earned the nickname Golden Foot. And this was because of the golden hem that was around the bottom of her dress. She was also compared to the mythical Amazonian queen Penthesilea. I think I said that right. But the people, they greatly admired her and loved her just for her beauty and her vivacious character. So the royal couple, while in Byzantine, heard rumors about an incredible victory by King Conrad of Germany over the Turks. And so they left the city to retake Edessa, and they were filled with optimism that the battle would soon be over. Unfortunately, it was a lie, and the German forces had been massacred by the Turks. So soon after they left Byzantine, they were ambushed by the Turks. Luckily, their forces were able to push the Turks back, and they even took the Turkish camp at that time. So Louis led his forces through the mountains, and there they encountered the remains of the slaughtered German army. Now, the Turks were trailing them all the time, just waiting for a good chance to attack. Now, Eleanor, because she brought so many women with her, she had a lot more baggage that had to be carried on this crusade. So the part of the forces that were carrying all the baggage, they were in the back. And then Eleanor, she was more up towards the front, leading her group from Aquitaine. Now the Turks could see that there was a break in the army. There was a break because the ones with the bags, they had to go a lot slower. And so Eleanor and her group, they crossed the summit of the mountain, and they were quite a bit ahead and kept going. And just as there was this break, the Turks attacked, and they attacked the back of the line. And this is where Louis was. And so the French forces, they found themselves between steep drops and the Turks in front of them. So men, horses, all of them were pushed over the crevices and killed. So anyone who was wearing royal regalia, unfortunately, were killed quite brutally. Their skulls bashed in and their limbs severed. And lucky for Louis, he was dressed as a peasant that day, and he escaped by going down the side of the mountain and just holding on to the rocks, and he was able to escape. But most of his closest men who were dressed royally were all killed. The blame for this massive defeat and the carnage that ensued was firmly placed on Eleanor for bringing so much excess baggage for herself and her ladies. As you might imagine, Louis and Eleanor weren't getting along so well about this time in the crusade. And Louis, he just wanted to go and be a pilgrim and go to Jerusalem. But Eleanor had been spending a lot of time with her Uncle Raymond, and she insisted that they attack the Muslim forces. So this disagreement really hurt their marriage, and it brought up some really nasty rumors about Eleanor and her Uncle Raymond in terms of incest. And this was the first time that Louis stood up and told his wife no. So, long story short, there was another battle. They lost horribly. The whole crusade was a failure, and the couple was barely on speaking terms. They couldn't stand to be around each other so much that they had to take separate ships back home. So while the royal couple was traveling home in their two different ships, a big storm came and hit them quite hard. And for 2 months, nobody knew where they were. They were presumed dead until Eleanor's ship suddenly made port in Sicily. And Louis then showed up in Calabria. So while they had been lost for those 2 months, Eleanor's beloved Uncle Raymond was captured and beheaded by the Turks. And when she found out, she was completely bereaved, and she was just devastated for quite a while. So after all of this drama and sadness, Eleanor, she just wanted out of the marriage. And so she tried to get the marriage annulled. Unfortunately, Louis would not agree, and neither did Pope Eugene III agree. And in fact, Pope Eugene III commanded the two of them that they had to stay in the same bed moving forward in their marriage. And as a result, they had their second daughter. Even though they had another daughter, the couple still hated each other and couldn't stand to be around each other. And so Louis started to worry that he actually would never have a male heir with Eleanor. So he started to warm up to the idea of an annulment. And so they wrote up the papers, and Eleanor arranged to be able to keep all of her lands of Aquitaine for herself, and that her two daughters would not be declared bastards. So, and together very happily on March 11th, 1152, they had an annulment proceeded over by the Archbishop and went their separate ways. Only 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis VII, Eleanor was married to Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy. This marriage meant that the English Henry, Eleanor's new husband, had even more land in France than her ex, the King of France, had, Louis VII. And this really irritated Louis, so he sent his forces to attack Henry. So while Henry was busy fighting off Louis, his uncle, who was the King of England, Stephen, he thought that he would attack some of Henry's castles in England and be able to take more land for himself, since Henry was so busy fighting with the King of France. big mistake, because Henry was not distracted, in fact, and he took care of Louis's forces, and then he took care of his uncle Stephen, the King of England. So they fought, and at some point they made a truce, and the truce was that the fighting would end and Stephen would make Henry his heir to the English throne. Within just a few years after this agreement, Stephen got a terrible stomach ailment and he died. As a result, on October 25th, 1154, Eleanor and Henry became the Queen and King of England. So the former Queen of France was now the Queen of England. So Eleanor and Henry, as King and Queen of England, had 8 children together, 5 sons and 3 daughters. They had William, who died at the age of 3. They had Henry, who was named for his father. They had Richard the Lionheart. They had Geoffrey, the Duke of Brittany, John, which we know as Prince John from literature, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, and then lastly Raymond VI. Both Richard and John later became kings of England. Her daughter Matilda married into Bavaria, her daughter Eleanor into Castile, and her daughter Joan into Sicily. And so Eleanor had the nickname Grandmother of Europe. So despite their 8 children together, Eleanor and Henry did not have a happy marriage. He was a tireless philanderer. He had many, many affairs and would often flaunt them in her face. And, they argued a lot. And he was further annoyed because all of Aquitaine would not answer to him. They would only answer to Eleanor. About 15 years into their marriage, Eleanor and Henry were barely on speaking terms. So she moved back to France, to Poitiers, and they agreed to separate. So back in France, Eleanor was instrumental in turning Poitiers into a center for poetry, and also for courtly life and manners. She was a great patron of the poetic movements of that day. So it's said that Eleanor created the court of love in this time. We don't know actually if it's true or not, but she is credited in most histories for having this court of love with her daughter, Marie. And Marie was her daughter from her marriage with Louis. But it was said that they would sit in this court and that couples would come and they would share their marital problems or their love problems with them. And Eleanor and Marie and maybe a few more, they would make decisions and try to help them with their love problems. So in the years that followed, Eleanor's sons and daughters, with Henry II, the King of England, whom she is separated from, she's in France, he's in England, their children are growing up, and John, one of the younger sons, he was about to get married. Now, John was his father's favorite, and so his father was going to take from his lands and bequeath John 3 castles. Now, this would be fine if he had lots and lots of castles, but this really actually cut into the land holdings, and Henry, named for his father, who should have had that inheritance, was really upset. So he decided he was going to rebel against his father. Now, Eleanor, sitting there in France, decided that she would support him. And this is significant because Eleanor is in control of all of the fighting forces of Aquitaine. So she put a lot of her men behind her son, Henry, to fight his father and John. So in the end, her son Henry, he did not triumph. The father, the King of England, Henry II, he was the winner of this dispute, and he brought his sons back into the fold, and then he punished all of the noblemen and the people who had supported them. And he very much blamed Eleanor. And so he took Eleanor and he imprisoned her. At some times, some Christmases, she was able to see her children, but for the most part, she didn't get to see anyone, and she didn't even get to go outside. She was moved from castle to castle, and she just had basically the people taking care of her, so not much contact at all to the outside world. And she was particularly hurt by this because she absolutely loved her son Richard, to be known as Richard the Lionheart. And so she was really crushed not to be able to speak to him. Despite her imprisonment, Eleanor remained well loved by the people. And in Aquitaine, while she was imprisoned, her son Richard the Lionheart took over. So we mentioned that Henry II had been a terrible philanderer and put his affairs in the face of Eleanor. And there was one partner, Rosamond Clifford in particular, who he loved to shove in Eleanor's face. And they even had a son named Geoffrey. And so they had a son named Geoffrey, and Eleanor and Henry had a son named Geoffrey. So he had two sons named Geoffrey, and Henry had insisted that his son with Rosamond be put with his own family and raised with his own children in Eleanor's household. He was always pushing to try to get Eleanor to request an annulment from him, because I think he was hoping, we think that he would be able to take her lands if she annulled the marriage. So, but Eleanor, she was super stubborn, and she was like, nope, it's fine. So she never gave him the satisfaction of an annulment of their marriage. And while she was imprisoned, Rosamond was actually in court with Henry, ruling in her place. Rosamond ended up dying while Eleanor was imprisoned. And people like to say that Eleanor killed her, that she stuck out of prison and she poisoned her, or she cut her arms in a bathtub. And there's terrible rumors about what she might have done, but when in fact she was imprisoned at this time, so she could not have killed her. So the family disagreements continued. There was disagreements between father and sons, as well as sons and sons. But the next time there was a big family disagreement, it was between Henry the Younger again and Geoffrey versus their father, Henry II. But this time, Richard the Lionheart took the father's side, and then they battled. So once again, Henry II, the King of England, he defeated his son Henry and Geoffrey with the help of his son Richard. And Henry the Younger, then he got dysentery, and he knew he was going to die, and so he became penitent, and he begged his father for the release of his mother just before his death. A few years later, Geoffrey was killed in a jousting accident. So with Henry the Younger now dead, Richard the Lionheart and the son we know as Prince John were very much vying to be named heir to Henry II, their father. So Henry II, his favorite was John. Eleanor's favorite was Richard. So Richard wanted his father to name him his heir, as he was the oldest son now. But Henry refused. And Richard had become close with the King of France, King Philip. And his father, Henry, really did not like this. But when he refused to name Richard as his heir, Richard then pledged his allegiance to King Philip of France, and together they attacked Henry II. So after some fighting, Henry II, the King of England, he decided that he wanted to end the fighting with his son, Richard the Lionheart, and the King of France. And so he said, okay, Richard, I will name you as my heir. But in the midst of the conflict between them, he learned that his favorite son, Prince John, had switched sides and had joined his brother Richard to battle against him. And the shock of this knowledge was just too much for him. And so he died on July 6th, 1189. So at this time, Eleanor was released from her imprisonment by her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, the new King of England. And she was 67 years old. She, 2-3 times as old as most women live. She was still vivacious. She was still beautiful. She was still strong-willed. And she spent her time traveling and drumming up support for her son, the new king, and having people to take oaths of allegiance to him. Eleanor returned a lot of the lands that her husband, Henry II, had confiscated. She let political prisoners out of jail and other prisoners who would just promise to take an oath to support Richard. She lifted a lot of the oppression. She stopped the sheriffs who had been abusing the people from doing that. And just generally, she lifted a lot of the oppression that had been in place during her husband's rule. It's very much like the tale of Robin Hood in the end, where the people stop being abused and they start to be able to take care of themselves again. Eleanor, she was the picture of a wise and caring queen, and she lived till the ripe old age of 80 and died April 1st in 1204. She was laid to rest by her husband, Henry II, and her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. So we're in Eleanor today, and I am going to be going through a brainstorming session about how we're going to redecorate this room. So as it is now, it's just fine. We have sort of a green theme, if you would, but it's a little bit disconnected, and we have sort of a Indian inspired or Aztec sort of inspired rug here. So we basically want to kind of pull the design of this room all together and make it all fit together beautifully, but also to bring out the personality of Eleanor, our French queen. Now, one thing to consider is that Eleanor was the queen of both France and of England. So we could have design inspiration from both France and English coming through in this room. So something to keep in mind is that we want our design, our story of the French queen to be very subtle. So we don't want you to walk in and there's a big French flag on the wall and there's Eleanor's portrait and it's a little bit, too heavy-handed. If you came in off the street and you knew nothing about Queen's Escape and the fact that this room was named for a queen, we would want you to just feel like you stayed in a really beautiful room in a chateau. So it needs to be subtle. So what we know about Eleanor was that she came from the Aquitaine region, and that includes Bordeaux. So if ever we were going to offer a guest a bottle of wine in the room, then in this room it would make sense that it's Bordeaux. So that's sort of a no-brainer. Eleanor was known to dress with a lot of color and to be really alive, intelligent, strong-willed. So when you walk into this room, I think this colors need to be colorful and strong, and you need to sort of feel that vivaciousness. So that is a really good guide for how we want to do in here. Eleanor had a nickname which was Golden Foot, and this was because of the golden hem around her dress. And just a rough thought that I had was that there are the floorboards around here. If you want to look at them, they might be that we would paint them gold, just as a really subtle reference to her being called Golden Foot. So something to know about Eleanor is that she had 10 children. So if we were going to bring in any portraits, maybe it is that we printed out her, you know, her family tree with all of the children's names and heads. We found a nice image of this, and this could be a subtle room decoration. Or maybe it's 10 portraits, you know, something like that. That's just a thought. Richard the Lionheart was her favorite son. And there are lots of images of Richard the Lionheart available that's in the public domain. So that might be, if we had a really large painting or a photo on the wall, having it be Richard of Lionheart would be, you know, a little insight to the fact that this was her favorite son. So Eleanor was also a patron of the poetic movements of that day. She was really into poetry and music, chivalry and manners. And so this sort of, if we take this as an inspiration for us, you know, we want to think, okay, how could we bring poetry into this room? Maybe it is that we have a bookshelf and it's full of all poetry or manners books. You know, how do we bring the idea of music into this room without disturbing the other guests? You know, this was coming from the belief that Eleanor formed the court of love, where she and her daughter Marie presided over the love quarrels of couples and made decisions. So it feels like, you know, Eleanor representing love could be also an inspiration for what we do here. Maybe that's just, you know, maybe we use red, for example, for the curtains or something like that, something to suggest passion. Maybe it helps to inspire our color palette. Now also, Eleanor was imprisoned for 17 years. So while we don't want to put bars on the windows, you know, maybe there's something to, maybe that gives us some sort of inspiration for something that we do in here. I'm not sure about that. And then, of course, Eleanor's story, her son's stories, you know, Prince John and Richard the Lionheart, you know, was an inspiration for Robin Hood. And so maybe, you know, some of the decor depicting that story is featured maybe in the bathroom or, you know, on the walls here. I'm not sure. And then the one remaining artifact we have from Eleanor's story is this glass rock crystal. It's a rock crystal vase with gold that's in the Louvre. So if we take the inspiration for this crystal vase, maybe that's what we can bring in here to put on the mantle. You know, if we could get a couple replicas of this, it would be awesome to have them on the mantle. We know we need a big mirror here. That's a given. We need that. But perhaps, I've searched and I haven't been able to find replicas of this rock crystal, but if we could, that would be really cool to have here. And I think, you know, that's basically what I have for Eleanor. You know, I think just as a feeling, you know, we want it to feel, you know, as alive and vivacious and strong-willed and interesting as she was. So I think, if nothing else, we know that the room shouldn't be soft, it shouldn't be pastel, it shouldn't be demure. I mean, it should be wow, but in a beautiful way. So it's a good starting point. We wanted to cook one of Eleanor of Aquitaine's favorite dishes, but unfortunately there's absolutely no record of any of the recipes dating from the 12th century. So we have lists of foods that they ate. We have an idea of the kind of things that the nobles ate and the kind of things that the peasants ate. And a lot of those things we wouldn't be able to get. So for example, swan, heron, peacocks. We can't cook that sort of thing, but that's probably what adorned her table most often, was meats roasted over an open flame and exotic meats that the cooks could then arrange beautifully. But we know that birds of the air were considered a very noble food. So chickens, they don't fly so well, so they probably weren't considered as noble as perhaps like a duck. So we have duck, and we're going to cook a duck today in honor of Eleanor, very simply based on how she might have had it. Now, if we were going to be 100% authentic, we would take these ducks and we would put them on a spit and we would roast them on an open fire. But Bo told me that's probably not a good idea because we don't exactly have the equipment for that. So we will bake the duck in the oven and we will just pretend that it was roasted on an open fire.
Now, almost all we know about medieval cuisine has been derived from Western sources, and the oldest surviving culinary manuscript from Christian Europe was most likely composed in the first half of the 13th century. And this was 100 years after Eleanor was born, so we can't really be sure if they were eating the same things 100 years later. France was dominated by power relations and control by religion and a well-defined social class hierarchy in medieval society, and they viewed food in the same way. So there were some foods that were nobler to eat and some that were more peasantly to eat. Their qualities and nutritional virtues were considered based on the natural elements, so everything that came close to heaven and therefore to God was particularly sought after. In contrast, anything under the earth was considered rude. So the people of that time, they had this elaborate gastronomic code based on the elements. So you have the four elements. You have fire, air, water, and earth. And the thought was that fire was the noblest element. Air was the second noblest. Water was the third. And then earth was at the very bottom. So anything that was grown inside the earth, like root vegetables or close to the earth, this was peasant food. This was not for the royals. So we're talking, carrots, onions and garlic were particularly offensive. They didn't have potatoes. Those arrived in the 16th century later. So anything on or close to the earth, cabbage, for example, this was not really desirable food. Cereals, breads, and fruits were a little bit more acceptable because they grew up out of the earth and into the air. And then the second least desirable element was water. And so anything that came out of the water, fish, for example, these are not as lowly as the carrots and the root vegetables and anything in the earth. But the fact was that 2 or 3 times during the week, they weren't allowed to eat meat for religious reasons. So they had to eat fish. And because they were eating fish so much, they kind of didn't really prize fish. So earth vegetables were the lowest. Water animals and vegetables were the second lowest. And then we come to air. Birds that flew in the air were considered quite desirable. And then food that was associated with fire, that could be cooked on a fire, were also desirable. Nobility preferred meat roasted. It was the best food for sustaining strength, and it became a symbol of power. Game, in particular, was desired because it was the product of hunting, and this is a warrior-like ability. It was common that dishonored knights, they might be asked to give up their arms, but also they might be asked to give up eating meat, because this was associated with being noble or being respected. So birds that fly in the air were very popular. Heron, swan, peacock. These were often favored by those who would cook for the nobles because they could be presented in a grand way, with their long necks and their feathers. The highest regarded animals were the phoenix and the salamander, but of course, these are mystical. I see a heron this morning on my walk. Back in Eleanor's day, that would have been a nice choice for dinner. So on the table we have the chopped up duck, and you would also see on our plate some vegetables, which include potatoes and carrots and beans and peas. You really wouldn't see this on Eleanor's plate because anything that grew close to or in the ground, like root vegetables, was considered lower class, and potatoes weren't even introduced to France until the 16th century. But we wanted to have a vegetable, and that's what we could have. Part of Eleanor's territory included Bordeaux. We stuffed the duck with apples and with raisins, because these were two fruits that were available during the 12th century.
Cheers.
Cheers to Eleanor.